Your 1 acre isn't the problem. Your system is. And most people never figure that out. They spend years convinced that a productive homestead just takes more hours, more sweat, more sacrifice. They wake up before the sun, go to bed after dark, and still feel like they're falling behind. And the worst part? They blame themselves. They think they're not tough enough, not experienced enough, not dedicated enough. But that's not it at all. The real problem has nothing to do with your work ethic, your land size, or your budget. The real problem is that you were handed a model that was never designed to be efficient. Nobody taught you to build systems. They just told you to work harder. Here's what I want you to understand by the end of this video. 1 acre, managed correctly, can feed a family for an entire year on roughly 8 hours of work per week. Not 8 hours a day, 8 hours a week. And I'm not talking about some minimal survival-level diet. I'm talking about eggs, vegetables, meat, preserved food for winter, and enough variety that you stop thinking about the grocery store entirely. That's the promise. And it's not a fantasy. It's a system. Right now, if you're anything like most homesteaders I've talked to, your week looks something like this. You walk out in the morning with a list that never gets shorter. You water things by hand because the irrigation still isn't set up right. You move feed from one corner of the property to another because nothing is positioned close to where it actually needs to go. You spend 40 minutes doing something that should take 5, and by the time you're done, 3 other things are already waiting. You end the week exhausted, and you're still making a grocery run on Saturday. That's not a land problem. That's a systems problem. And here's a number that stopped me in my tracks when I first came across it. The average unplanned homestead wastes between 15 and 30 hours of labor every single week on tasks that either don't need to happen at all or are being done in the wrong order at the wrong time of year. 15 to 30 hours. That's almost an entire second job, spent on inefficiency. If that number resonates with you, you're in the right place. Subscribe right now, because this is exactly what I break down every week. Real systems, real numbers, real results from a real piece of land. Hit that button and stay with me, because what comes next is the part that changes everything. The good news is that the solution isn't complicated. It's not expensive, and it doesn't require you to work more. It requires you to work differently and at the right time of year. Because the single biggest shift that happened on my property wasn't a new tool or a new crop. It was understanding that a well-designed homestead doesn't run on daily hustle. It runs on seasonal intelligence. And that's exactly what we're going to build together, starting right now. There's something worth understanding before we get into the system itself. This idea that a small piece of land can sustain a family without consuming every waking hour isn't new, not even close. For hundreds of years, rural families managed their properties on rhythm, not brute force. They didn't work the land every day with equal intensity. They worked in bursts, aligned with what the season was actually asking for. Spring was for planting. Summer was for maintaining and harvesting. Fall was for preserving and preparing. Winter was for resting, planning, and repairing. Each season had a job. And because each job was done at the right time, the next season required less effort, not more. That knowledge didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the industrial model told us that productivity means constant activity. Factories run 24 hours. Supply chains don't pause. And somewhere along the way, that thinking bled into how people approach their land. The idea of seasonal rhythm started to feel old-fashioned, like something that belonged to a different era. So people abandoned it. And in its place, they picked up the habit of doing everything, every day, all year long. The people rediscovering this today aren't agricultural researchers or university extension programs. They're ordinary homesteaders who got tired enough to stop and ask a simple question. What if I stopped adding more tasks and started removing the ones that don't actually need to happen right now? And the answer, almost every time, is the same. The reason it works today is exactly the same reason it worked 200 years ago. because land responds to intelligent management, not to exhaustion. So let's talk about what that actually looks like in practice. The first piece of the system is zone layout. This is the most unglamorous part of the whole conversation, and it's also the one that changes everything. Most people set up their homestead based on where things fit, not where they make sense. The chicken coop ends up on one end of the property because there was space there. The garden ends up near the house because that felt right. The compost pile ends up somewhere in the middle because nobody thought about it at all. And then every single day, the homesteader is walking from one end to the other, carrying things back and forth, losing 10 minutes here and 15 minutes there. Zone layout fixes that by organizing the property around frequency of use. The things you interact with every single day, egg collection, fresh herbs, salad greens, water access, belong within about 30 feet of your back door. The things you visit a few times a week, main vegetable beds, rabbit hutches, compost, belong in the next ring out. The things that only need attention once or twice a month, fruit trees, perennial crops, bulk storage, go to the outer edges of the property. When everything is positioned correctly, your daily routine stops being a series of small hikes and becomes a short, predictable loop that takes minutes instead of hours. On a well-zoned 1-acre property, this single change can eliminate 3 to 5 hours of unnecessary movement every week. Every week. Without changing what you grow, what animals you keep, or how hard you work. The second piece is the seasonal calendar. And this is where the 8-hour week actually becomes possible. The core idea is simple. Concentrate your hardest work into a few short windows of the year, and let the rest of the year run on maintenance. Most homesteaders do the opposite. They spread heavy labor across every month, and end up with no season that ever feels easy. Here's how the year actually breaks down when you plan it right. Winter is your planning and infrastructure season. You're not producing much, but you're making every decision that will reduce your workload for the next 9 months. You're mapping your garden beds, ordering seeds strategically, repairing irrigation lines, and fixing anything that caused you extra work the previous year. It sounds quiet, and it is, but that quiet is doing enormous work. Spring is your highest intensity window. You're putting systems into place, laying drip lines, setting up beds, transplanting starts, installing fencing. This is when you work hard on purpose, because the work you do in spring directly determines how light your summer will be. A homesteader who rushes through spring setup pays for it in daily summer labor. One who takes spring seriously barely has to think about maintenance from June through August. And that's exactly where we're headed next, because what summer actually looks like when you've set everything up correctly is something most homesteaders have never experienced. But before we get there, let me show you how the individual pieces of this system connect to each other, because that's where the real efficiency lives. Summer on a well-designed homestead is almost disorienting the first time you experience it. You walk outside in the morning, do your 30-minute loop, and then that's it. The irrigation is running on a timer. The mulch is suppressing the weeds. The beds are producing without you having to intervene every day. You have this strange feeling that you must be forgetting something. You're not. That's just what a system that actually works feels like. This is where the third piece of the framework comes in, the high efficiency zone. Most homesteaders treat their vegetable garden like it needs constant hands-on attention, and when it's set up wrong, it does. Without mulch, you're pulling weeds 3 times a week. Without drip irrigation, you're hand watering every morning. Without permanent beds, you're tilling and replanting entire sections from scratch every season. Each of those things seems small on its own. Together, they add up to 15 or 20 hours a week just in the garden alone. The high efficiency zone fixes this by making the garden work for you instead of the other way around. Permanent raised beds or no-dig beds mean your soil structure builds year after year without tilling. A 4 to 6 inch layer of wood chip mulch applied once in spring means almost zero weeding from May through October. Drip irrigation on a basic timer means watering happens whether you're there or not. And succession planting, staggering crops by 2 to 3 weeks instead of planting everything at once, means you're harvesting something every single week without a single overwhelming glut. A properly set up high-efficiency zone of just 1,500 square feet can produce enough vegetables for a family of 4 for most of the year. And once it's installed, it runs on about 2 hours of attention per week during the growing season. 2 hours for a family's worth of vegetables. Here's the part most people get completely wrong. They think more plants means more food. What it actually means without the right system is more work for the same or less return. Density without design is just chaos with better intentions. If you're finding this useful and want to go deeper, there's a complete guide linked in the description and in the first comment below. It covers everything from bed layout templates to exact succession planting schedules, drip system setups, and a full seasonal task calendar you can print and follow week by week. Everything in one place, built around the same system we're walking through right now. Check it out after the video, and keep watching, because the next piece is the one that surprises people the most. The fourth component is animal integration. And this is where the homestead stops feeling like a collection of separate projects and starts feeling like a single living system. Most people who keep chickens think of them as egg producers. And they are. But a chicken that's only thought of as an egg producer is also a full-time maintenance job. You're buying feed, cleaning the coop, managing bedding, dealing with pests in the garden separately, and hauling kitchen scraps out to the birds by hand every day. Each of those tasks exists in isolation. Now think about what happens when you design around integration. Your chickens rotate through the garden beds in the off-season, scratching up pest larvae, eating weed seeds, and depositing nitrogen directly into the soil. Your kitchen scraps go to the birds produce eggs and manure, the manure goes to the compost, and the compost feeds the garden. Nothing gets carried anywhere unnecessarily. Nothing gets wasted. The system processes its own byproducts. Add a small colony of meat rabbits, 8 to 12 does, and you have a low-noise, low-odor protein source that can produce over 200 pounds of meat per year from a single hutch setup. Rabbit manure is cold, meaning it can go directly onto garden beds without composting first. No waiting, no pile management. Straight from the hutch to the soil. And with a basic automated feeder and a gravity-fed watering system, daily rabbit care takes about 10 minutes. The difference between an exhausting homestead and a sustainable one almost always comes down to this: whether the outputs of each element are feeding the inputs of another. When they are, you stop being the one carrying everything manually from one end of the property to the other. The system carries itself. The fifth piece, and this is where the 8-hour week stops being a concept and becomes a schedule, is the weekly rhythm. Here's what it actually looks like, broken down. Monday through Friday, your daily routine is 20 to 30 minutes. You collect eggs, do a quick visual check on the animals, glance at the irrigation, and harvest anything that's ready. That's it. On Saturday morning, you spend 2 to 3 hours on the week's main work, a real harvest pass, any replanting, checking compost, and one small maintenance task. Sunday is either rest or one of the seasonal jobs that come around a few times a year. A deep coop clean, a bed refresh, a preservation session. Added up across a full week. Roughly 30 minutes daily times 5 days is 2.5 hours. Add the Saturday block of 2 to 3 hours. You're at 5 to 5.5 hours of regular weekly work. The remaining time in your 8-hour budget goes towards seasonal tasks, which, spread across the weeks of a season, average out to less than 3 hours per week over the full year. That's the math. And it holds. But there's one more layer that most people overlook entirely, and without it, the whole system eventually breaks down. That's coming next. I know what you're probably thinking right now. This sounds like a lot to set up all at once, and honestly, I thought the exact same thing. Actually, I didn't just think it. I used it as a reason to keep doing things the hard way for longer than I'd like to admit. Before I reorganized this property, my mornings started at 5:30. Not because I wanted them to, because there was no other way to get everything done before the heat of the day made outdoor work miserable. I was watering by hand because the drip system was still on my to-do list. I was hauling kitchen scraps across the property every evening because the chickens were on the wrong end of the land. I was replanting entire beds from scratch because I'd never set up succession planting. So I'd get a wave of zucchini in July that I couldn't possibly eat fast enough, and then nothing for 6 weeks. I was exhausted by 9 in the morning and still ending the week with a grocery run. And the frustrating part was that I wasn't lazy. I was working constantly. I just had no system. Every task existed in its own little silo. Nothing fed anything else. Nothing reduced the work that came after it. I was just running the same broken loop, week after week, getting more tired and wondering what I was doing wrong. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with one honest question. What am I doing every day that I could either eliminate or do once a season instead? I made a list. It was longer than I expected. I started with the irrigation. 3 days of work, 1 summer of daily hand watering gone forever. Then I moved the chickens closer to the house and rerouted their rotation through the garden beds. Then I redrew the entire planting schedule around succession and stopped trying to grow everything at once. Within 1 full seasonal cycle, so about 12 months, the property was running in a way I genuinely didn't think was possible before. My regular weekly work dropped to just under 7 hours. My grocery spending dropped by roughly 60%. And for the first time since we started this whole thing, I actually had Saturday afternoons free. I wasn't working harder. I was finally working with the right system. Now, here's where most people run into trouble, even when they understand the framework. Because knowing what to do and avoiding the most common mistakes are 2 different things. The first mistake is planting everything at once. It feels productive. You have seeds, you have beds, you have energy in early spring, so you plant it all in the same 2-week window. And then 6 weeks later, you have more lettuce than your family can eat, and 8 weeks after that, you have nothing. Succession planting means staggering the same crops 2 to 3 weeks apart throughout the season. It feels slower at first. The harvest is steadier for months. The second mistake is keeping animals without integrating them into the rest of the system. I've seen people with chickens that are basically an isolated maintenance job, a coop that needs cleaning, a feeder that needs filling, and no connection to anything else on the property. The birds should be working. They should be cycling through garden beds, processing scraps, and generating fertility. If your animals are only producing 1 output and consuming 1 input, you're running a pet operation, not a homestead system. The third mistake is treating every part of the property with the same level of daily attention. Not everything needs daily management. Fruit trees need almost nothing from June through August once they're established. Perennial herb beds are essentially self-sufficient. Garlic goes in the ground in fall and doesn't need attention until summer. When you start categorizing your tasks by actual frequency requirement instead of anxious daily inspection, you recover hours you didn't even know you were losing. And the fourth mistake, the one that surprises people most, is over-diversifying too early. The instinct is understandable. You want variety, resilience, self-sufficiency across every category. So you add ducks and turkeys and a small orchard and a berry patch and a herb spiral all in the first year. And suddenly you have 12 systems, none of them dialed in, all of them demanding attention at the same time. The most productive homesteads I've seen run deep on a few things before they expand. Master your core system first. Diversify once it runs without you thinking about it. If this is clicking for you, subscribe and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this content reach people who need it. And drop a comment below telling me, which one of these mistakes have you been making? I read every single one, and I'll reply. The system works. The mistakes are fixable. And what the other side of all this actually looks like, that's what we're getting to right now. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like on the other side. It's a Tuesday morning in late July. You wake up without an alarm. You make coffee. You walk outside around 7, and the air still has that cool edge that disappears by 9. You do your loop. Chickens, a quick check on the beds, Pull a handful of tomatoes that are ready. Glance at the water pressure on the drip line. 25 minutes. You're back inside before your coffee gets cold. Your kitchen counter has a bowl of eggs collected this morning and a pile of cucumbers from yesterday's harvest. The freezer has rabbit from last month and chicken stock you made in a 2-hour batch session 3 weeks ago. The root cellar, or in your case, maybe just a cool corner of the garage, has onions and potatoes from June that will last through November. You haven't been to the grocery store for anything except olive oil and coffee in 11 days. That's not a fantasy. That's what July looks like when you did February, right? And here's the thing that nobody talks about enough. It's not just the time you get back. It's the feeling underneath it. There's a particular kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your land is working. You stop feeling behind. You stop feeling like the property is something you're constantly managing before it falls apart. It starts to feel like something that's running with you instead of against you. That shift, from reactive to intentional, is worth more than any single technique in this video. Your kids, if you have them, start to understand where food actually comes from. Not in an abstract way. In a Tuesday morning, here's the egg, here's the chicken that laid it kind of way. That's not a small thing. The freedom this system creates isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, in Saturday afternoons that belong to you again, in the absence of that low-level anxiety about falling behind, in the moment you realize you haven't stressed about grocery prices in 2 months because they've stopped being your problem the way they used to be. That's what 1 acre, managed with intention, actually gives you. It's not about doing less. It's about doing the right things at the right time so everything else takes care of itself. If this changed how you think about your homestead, or the homestead you're building toward, subscribe and hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps this reach someone who's been up since 5:30 this morning, wondering why their land isn't working the way they hoped it would. And tell me in the comments, what's the first change you're making this week? A zone layout adjustment? Setting up drip irrigation finally? Moving the chickens? I want to know. I read every single comment, and sometimes those replies turn into the next video.